Forkfest.party. It's gonna be a party.
What is the most popular or impressive thing the U.S. government has ever done? As bad as it is, there has to be one thing that was least bad. The one that probably jumps to mind most commonly for people is beating the Nazis. And as brutal as the process sometimes was, as indiscriminate as the process sometimes was, I guess that probably does rise near the top of the list. Probably if we're using that type of list, then the more impressive accomplishment was defeating the Soviet Union without a direct conflict. To a large extent, that was actually the doing of the Russian people, but yeah, it's like Sun Tzu used to say, if he was in fact only one person, what the ancients called a clever fighter is one who not only wins, but excels at winning with ease. Hence his victories bring him neither credit for courage nor reputation for wisdom. That's almost an exact quote, not quite. Despite the relatively large amount of killing that did happen in the Cold War, it was nothing compared to World War I, and the strategic results were much better for the world, despite their many imperfections. But of course, despite the lack of large-scale fighting, or at least worldwide fighting, the Cold War was an extremely expensive and burdensome operation for taxpayers, to say nothing of the many third world people who ended up on the wrong side of helicopter gunships through no fault of their own. So I've always wondered how could something like that be done without taxpayer expense and with much less risk to civilian life, at least less risk imposed by the liberators. And although I don't really have good answers for that in the Cold War, I have been thinking a lot about how we would apply that question to the current Cold War. How do the freedom-loving people of the world contain China, or rather the Chinese Communist Party, without taxpayer expenditure? Well, first, Gandhi said you should be the change you want to see in the world, so, and more applicable to me, he also said, what you will do will be insignificant, but it is very important that you do it. So I'll start by talking about the pretty insignificant things that I've been doing over the last year about the Chinese communist threat, since sort of becoming awakened to it by the Rona, as I hope the rest of the world is becoming. So the first thing I did was to find out what the Chinese government is doing in New Hampshire, if anything, so that I can begin reporting on it. And I made about 8 calls to talk radio, updating them on what I found, which of course is the Confucius Center at the University of New Hampshire, a Han-Ban-funded CCP outpost, which is ostensibly supposed to be teaching Mandarin and Chinese culture. I've begun treating that as their consulate and have staged one protest there. Well, it was a solo protest, and there weren't any of them there to see it at the time. And then I've gone back a second time. I have been trying to find one of them to try and ask them questions on camera. You know, it's not going to change the world much, but it's what I've been able to do so far. And I've got my Mandarin vocabulary up to 600 words. I can speak basic phrases. Know your enemy, as Sun Tzu would say. And speaking of Sun Tzu, it's important to approach this with almost an attitude of reverence toward China and the Chinese people, recognizing that we all share a common enemy in that institution which threatens them. By the way, the CCP is a threat even to Xi Jinping himself, right? Because, and he knows this, if he screws up, he could end up like some of the other Chinese Communist Party leaders who have been cast off to the side or house imprisoned or worse. Usually this doesn't happen to the people at the very top. But the CCP is actually a pretty bad deal, even for people who are close to the top, because they always have to be looking over their shoulder. it has so much power that it can even hurt them. Now, at a governmental level or a macro level, the first and most important thing, perhaps, to do with the CCP, the Chinese government, is treat it fairly, kind of the way the Swiss government treated the Nazis. Now, I'm not saying that everything the Swiss government did with the Nazis was awesome, but it was a heck of a lot better than the way the rest, the way the West, the Allies treated the Nazis. And by better, I just mean it was simultaneously more firm and more fair. These trade restrictions that Western countries have placed on China are not fair. They're certainly not fair to American businessmen who'd like to do business in China. Just because the Chinese are restricting our trade doesn't mean it's right for us to restrict theirs. Trade is not like war. If you restrict trade with China, then you're stopping me from interacting with Chinese people in China on my own terms. It wouldn't even be right for you to stop me from trading with North Korea if I wanted to, or Iran. The travel restrictions are even questionable at taxpayer expense. I understand there was some need, or there was a feeling there of a need to do that for pandemic reasons, and that's, I guess, if that goes away after the pandemic, then that's good. I'll try not to be too judgmental about, actions against the pandemic, even if I think they should be voluntary rather than taxpayer funded. But again, locally there was an incident in New England where a New Hampshire man and his Chinese business partner were prosecuted by the feds for the way they handled their gun store. The Chinese national got in trouble for, well, I think they it's possible they both got in trouble for training, running what they called a training camp for Chinese nationals, showing them gun skills. Yes, it sounds a little bit sketchy when you think, if the person's a mainland Chinese person, what are they doing? However, there's nothing wrong with training. And by prosecuting these people over gun violations, like allegedly someone modified a gun in a way they weren't supposed to, that creates a legitimate grievance for the Chinese government, the Chinese people, and especially the family of this Chinese national. It's not fair treatment. If those people are plotting some kind of harm against Americans, then you prosecute them for that, and that might be fair. But I have heard no such allegation. And until I do, I'm looking at it the same way that man's family in mainland China would look at it, or similarly to the way the CCP would look at it. It's a grievance. Don't give them grievances. Don't give them any reason for hostility with the United States. No legitimate reason, at least. And again, that's just locally what I know off the top of my head. Imagine what else is going on behind the scenes or around the country, or stuff I just haven't found out yet. Now, that's the dovish Pollyanna, or at least kind part of my suggestions for how to contain China. There does have to be a stick, too. Obviously, I've already talked many times about the need to eliminate any gun laws in the United States, and for the United States government to voluntarily, peaceably pressure U.S. allies to do the same thing. If everybody if all the countries sort of facing off against China have gun freedom, we win. It's over. That's the reason, apparently, Xi Jinping has been complaining about United States gun freedom. That's a good sign. Such as it is, we don't have complete gun freedom, but now one of the anti-China hawks in the United States has suggested some different ideas. One of the things he says that should be done is to break the Chinese firewall. Now, that's a peaceful thing that can be done. I don't want a government doing it at taxpayer expense. But wow, wouldn't it be cool if we had, some stuff going on that was getting all kinds of information into China, and the Chinese government was losing its mind because it can't stop the information from getting to its people. Now that would be fun. and peaceable, and no, I don't see why it absolutely has to be done with taxpayer expense. Even if the firewall can't be broken, make them waste all their time trying to defend it. It would be really fun also to have, I'm not sure if their reaction would necessarily be fun, but it would be fun to have like a Taiwanese version or a Vietnamese version of the South Korean effort to send information to North Korea by air. So in South Korea, what they were doing was trying to launch balloons near the border at periods of time where the wind was going northbound. Unfortunately, the South Korean government and its busybody control freaks put a stop to this because they were so afraid the North Koreans would overreact. Well, this is sort of the whole point, right? You make them overreact, and when they overreact, they lose some of their power. I'd like to see. It'd be fun to have like people on the Chinese border in Vietnam, because I think Vietnam is more hostile to China than the U.S. is. get south of the border, in North Vietnam, northern part of Vietnam, as long as you can get away with it, and launch some drones and just send the drones over the border into China with information. Do it as a private effort. Now, maybe this is a little more reckless than the firewall breaking thing. If it's reckless, okay, we can talk about that, but it's an idea. It's a possibility. It's better than sending bombers. It's better than using tax dollars. There needs to be an underground railroad for defectors. There probably already is one. United States law should allow anyone from Hong Kong to live in the United States as a resident and become a citizen. There could be some kind of pressure on China, I would hope without taxpayer expense, for them to accept Jefferson centers, just the way we accept Confucius centers. This is not my idea. I got this from the hockey dude who has a lot of bad ideas, but this is one of his good ideas. We're not allowed to spread Western values at officially recognized centers in China. Why not? At least make that an issue. There's a claim that the world, the West, or maybe the Trump administration, or maybe even the previous administrations like Obama, have kind of, encircled Japan with a sea of allies. Let's see if that continues. It seems like it's better than some things that could be done. The Indian government is already pretty fanatically anti-Beijing, and India is not a country to be laughed off. It's also not a country with a history of aggression towards its neighbors, despite the current somewhat worrying nationalist trend at the top in India. So I guess I didn't mention all the things that I've done. I guess I've also done some reports on my channel, obviously, my YouTube channel here. They're always, or at least for now, they're playing second fiddle to the feds. I think the feds and, the local government problems that we have here in New Hampshire take priority because they're closer. But I've also begun talking a little bit. As you know, I run nhexit.com, so I am, one of New Hampshire's secessionists and thought, I hope the term thought leader doesn't sound too self-promoting. I hope I'm not overrating myself here. But, the Chinese misbehavior around the world, over the last year especially, has given me an idea, and that is that an independent New Hampshire could join NATO. And this is not something I would have been at all in favor of before the Chinese started really going bad, or the Chinese government started really going bad. But their lying to us about the coronavirus crisis woke me up and started to open my mind on that issue. Despite being anti-federal government, I've never really found myself to be anti-NATO. All kinds of countries and groups of people fit well into NATO, right? And in the number of atrocities it's committed is pretty small over the years. This was the organization, technically, that defeated the Soviet Union. Could NATO function if it didn't have a United States leading it? And if the United States was 50 countries? Well, I'm sure it could. Maybe it would be stronger. Maybe there would be less of a head to cut off. Maybe there would be fewer abuses by a government that got too big, aka the United States government. But, even with the United States government leading NATO, Greece never left it, right? Despite having anti-American socialist governments, one after another. France never really even decoupled from it completely. De Gaulle's disposition toward it was really pretty constructive, I think, and it was almost better that he left. And this, successive series of socialist French administrations remained pretty NATO-friendly. If you look at NATO's handling of the Bosnian crisis, I think that would possibly give some pause as to whether it's really a super decisive institution capable of acting quickly. But you can't say that they acted rashly, right? The NATO operations in Bosnia took 3 years to get underway and only took 3 weeks to win the war. In Kosovo, it took about 6 weeks, I think. And in neither case was there significant loss of life to NATO. There were some you could probably argue there were abuses committed against the Bosnian Serbs and the Kosovo Serbs. These were relatively small in scale. But the important thing is that they haven't been the aggressor for the most part. There's a reason why countries are lining up to join it, and have been for so many decades. It's not perfect, but think how much better it would be if New Hampshire were just under NATO and its local and state governments, as opposed to being under the United States. Having said that, I like Russell Canning's point that there are plenty of countries out there that don't have a military alliance, and they're very small and have no real military at all, in fact. And how much is China messing with them, right? Like, how much trouble is Costa Rica in right now? With no military, a Swiss foreign policy, no real alliances, in a rough neighborhood with a climate that is not conducive to economic growth, more conducive to being hit by hurricanes, and yet they do well. And I can say that for so many different countries. Now, they may come under threat later, and we may have to be ready to come under threat later. But there are just so many different ways to deal with the Chinese government that don't involve massive expenditures, abuses of Chinese nationals, wars, nuclear annihilation. No, let's use these other steps so that we don't wind up having those used on us in the name of fighting China, or used on us by China. By the way, there's this claim people are making, like, well, we told you that free trade wouldn't work. We told you that you can't engage with China. Your claims about, openness, changing China, and that if they had economic freedom, then political freedom would follow. Well, that's proven to be false. Well, no, it hasn't proven to be false yet. It's proven to be true practically all over the world, except for China, where it may prove true later. So the economic freedom thingy worked for Taiwan. It gave them more political freedom. It worked for South Korea. It gave them more political freedom. And actually, for a while, economic freedom in China gave them more political freedom. When was the last time you were able to walk around the streets under Chairman Mao and openly criticize him, right? You'd be killed for doing that. But people in China do that all the time, in large numbers, on large scale. And on the record. They do it on social media. Now, the Great Firewall stops them from organizing street demonstrations, but they're able to criticize Chinese officials. I mean, politically, even under this Xi Jinping character, China is much freer than it was under Mao, or even in the early days of Xiaoping. If Xi Jinping changes that, well, he is changing that. He has already changed it. He's pushing them in the opposite direction as hard as he can, it seems like. But that's going to undermine their economic prosperity. And China's ties with the rest of the world are deep now. It's probably, the place is probably more like Bitcoin than it used to be, in the sense that it's harder to change China. Because it's just it's more spread out, it's bigger, there's more people, there's more ties with the rest of the world. Obviously, yes, we have to be firm with the Chinese government in many ways over the coming decade, but that doesn't mean we give up on the tried and true method of obtaining political freedom through economic freedom and free trade. Now, there was one last idea that I heard off the top of my head for containing China, and that is it's a terrible idea, which could be converted into a good idea. But this hawkish dude, whose name I can't remember, was saying, well, here's another thing we need to do to stop China. We need to play the Russia card. And I thought, yeah, that sounds good. And he said, we have a coup against Vladimir Putin. Well, of course, it wasn't really a coup. He was just saying to get rid of Vladimir Putin. So that's how you think? That's how you think we're going to play the Russia card, by interfering in who runs its government? That's the exact opposite of playing the Russia card. That's the kind of thing that makes Russians hate you. No, in my book, playing the Russian card would mean making peace with Vladimir Putin. And not peace, we already have peace, but mending fences in some form or fashion. The guy is not exactly Stalin, right? He's sometimes misguided, but bright, and sometimes bad, but rational foreign leader. He's Russia's Mustafa Kemal. You can't bully him, but you can reason with him. And whatever he says or whatever he thinks, he's got a, 2,000, 3,000 mile long border with China, and no border with the United States. Geographics trumps policy, trumps leadership, trumps ideology, ultimately. And that's the reason why even the much worse Russian governments of the past found themselves aligned against China, even when they were ideologically aligned with China. So anyway, at some point in the next few years, probably, China is really going to dawn on the American consciousness, and people are going to hit the panic button. There's going to be a Sputnik moment if COVID-19 wasn't it. But along with that panic button, there are all kinds of options. There's much hope, and this does not have to be done with big bloodshed or bankrupting taxpayer expense like the last Cold War was done. I just hope our rulers in Washington can see this, or see some of this, or most importantly, that they don't become partners in oppression with that hideous government in Beijing.
You've probably heard of Porkfest, but have you heard of Forkfest? It's a decentralized alternative. It's also at Rogers Campground at a slightly different time. You don't even need a ticket. Visit forkfest.party. It's gonna be a party.